God is so good. God is so good. He's so good to me. God answers prayer. God answers prayer. God answers prayer. He's so good to me.
A thought that has been on my mind a lot just recently because of the Bible study I'm in and because of doing some ancestry research, also looking at the various things in Sierra Leone that we've done or been a part of. Is that working for us?
You gotta get closer.
Not much.
Is that working better?
Yes.
There.
We'll do that. And the Bible study included this from 1 Samuel. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord before Eli, and word from the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were infrequent. It happened at that time, as Eli was lying down in his place, now his eyesight had begun to grow dim, and he could not see well. And the lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. That the Lord called Samuel, and he said, "Here am I." Then he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call. Lie down again." So he went and lay down. The Lord called yet again, "Samuel." So Samuel arose and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he answered, "I did not call, my son. Lie down again." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, nor had the word of the Lord yet been revealed to him. So the Lord called Samuel again for the third time. And he arose and went to Eli, and he said, "Here I am, for you called me." Then Eli discerned that the Lord was calling the boy. And Eli said to Samuel, "Go lie down, and it shall be, if he calls you, that you shall say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Then the Lord came and stood and called, as at other times, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." The Lord said to Samuel, "Behold, I am about to do a thing in Israel at which both ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. In that day I will carry out against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. For I have told him that I am about to judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knew, because his sons brought a curse on themselves, and he did not rebuke them." There's some very interesting things in this passage. And so what I'm really bringing out today is the thought that we are all called. God calls. I'd like to say that I made up my mind to go to Sierra Leone. I like to say I decided to do this and that, but so many times in my life I have to realize that it was really God who did the calling. And there are connections to that call. For example, when I was very small, before I was 8 years old, there was a fellow who came from Africa. His name was Moses Mahoy. He dressed up in African clothes, and he told all about Sierra Leone, and he explained about his time in America, and he just really appealed to me. And so I said, I'm going to be a missionary in Sierra Leone, West Africa. That's what I told the kids in school, and that's what I told my teacher. But then in addition to that, I needed to have the call of God to serve Him anywhere. And that came when I was 8 years old, and a traveling evangelist, Dr. Diedrich, came to our church. I was sitting on the front row as usual. That's where we were most of the time. If the doors of the church were open, we were there. And he had beautiful Cena-felt pictures. And they were painted by a lady over in the Cedar Falls area of Iowa. And at that time, he told about the terrible, horrible things in hell. And he had the beautiful, shining pictures of heaven. He showed them. I knew I was a sinner. I knew that I wasn't ready. I told lies. There were a lot of other things that, well, anyway, I was child number 4, and I think it took 8 more years before my parents had another one. I was a little hard to raise, okay? So here's this child, me, 8 years old. And when they sang that song, it didn't matter what the song was. I knew that I needed to come forward those few steps and receive Jesus Christ as my Savior. And be forgiven for all things that offended God, whether it was a single lie or a whole bunch of other things. And it changed my life, yes it did. And reading the Bible, praying, and all those kinds of things that I was led to do through Sunday school and church and so on. And then getting to Africa eventually. But I would like to think that all of us had a call to be where we are today, to be where we were some years ago in Africa or wherever. But right now I'm thinking in particular about my own family. We go as far as we can go back in my family. There was some circuit riding preacher who rode across the prairies in Iowa, and my grandfather became a Christian on my father's side, and there were Christians in the family way back on my mother's side. And back in the day, my grandfather, he had one child, and going to have this child and dedicate him to the Lord. He grew up, and he went off to college and never did become a pastor. But child number 15 was my father. None of those children became missionaries, but he was still waiting, my grandfather was still waiting, and so here came my father along, and he had 5 children, and 2 of us at least have stepped out of the country to share the gospel with people, my brother and myself. And I want you to be thinking today about the people in your life who God called to be a part of your life and to call you to Sierra Leone, to call you. Actually, there was a letter from Anna that called us to be together, right? The SOSL newsletter and various things. But the call of God came to Samuel as a boy, and that has blessed me all my life, because we don't want to neglect the children, do we? We don't want to miss the point at which God is calling them. Is he calling them at 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or whatever age? He was a very small boy, and he had a history too. As you know, his mother, she called out to God for what? She wanted a child. And she cried out and called out, and then God called her to himself and gave her that child that she wanted, and 5 more, I think. Theologians will all know that. So, today, we're going to think about various people. I'm going to read a little bit from a letter that I wrote home. And a couple of things from the notes that were taken in 2016 at our Sierra Leone group, which met at Brooks Howell. In each case, people shared who helped them answer that call. President Jim Malcolm, he talked about the people that had led him in his life. We had Bill and Kathy Hunter spoke of serving in Sierra Leone under Pastor Eustace Renner. Esther McGill went to work, and she worked with Dr. Silver. Do you see the chains that are going on there? Various people have helped us through different things in life. This is an example of how God put circumstances together. When I was living in Bonds, I agreed to help one girl attend the camp that would be a Christian camp, one of those fun camps that you talked about. And I said I would pay for Sally if I met Sally at the lorry station. Well, I was vexed. Prayed for the Lord to let me catch that lorry, and I missed it. When I finally did get transport and I arrived at the camp, I realized that both Geneva, who I wasn't sure was coming, and Sally was there too. I had only got the school fees for one person. And God's plans are perfect. Because the Lord knew if I had met Sally in the true, I would have sent her home. So he let me miss the lorry, and eventually paid Sally's school fees, camp fees, through another friend. God's plans are perfect. He wanted her at the camp because there she became a Christian. Like I said, it was a real mountaintop experience. There were tears in the goodbyes, and everyone went away singing through them. I'm going to thank Aunt Ruth for her gift of $25 today, and Stan's gift again for the gift that I used to pay those school fees, the camp fees, I should say. I trust my new salary has been deposited since I really need it now. Well, what happened? I have a picture of Geneva over there. Years and years have gone by, but Geneva actually is in charge of Child Evangelism Fellowship for all of Southern Florida. They sent the kids out, their two daughters out to Florida during the war, put them on the helicopter, not knowing if they'd see them again. They did, and how things have gone. Connections, all because of God's call. So I thought today it would be good if each of you would share a moment with some way that God has called you through another person. And we are going to sing a song first, while you're thinking about that. Dennis is going to play. It's little as much when God is in it.
Yeah.
Because missing a lorry, but catching up with a gal, get her to camp. I mean, who is that? The other thing, God
It's hard to
is,
see.
when God is in it. Well, anyway, let's sing this together. Dennis, an introduction, please.
Calling you.
You're just, how many of you can remember that faith beginning seed when you realized God was calling you? Maybe you didn't know exactly what to, but you knew you could hear his voice somehow. Well, yes. All right, so if you'd like to come up here and share that, that would be great. The first call of God on your life.
How about that?
First call on.
Share yours.
Time to, okay, we light the microphone to you. My foot on. No, the table's on. Okay. God used people. We like to really work.
I was a third grader when I received Jesus Christ into my heart and life as my Savior and Lord. Of course, the meaning of all of that has become greater through the decades. But I very soon after that experience of accepting Christ, I felt within myself that I was to be a missionary. And I had to think in those terms of what was familiar to me. And we had the mission band in the EUB, in the Evangelical Church. And so the children of our church were introduced to missions. And my mother would read to me the Missionary Jim magazine that I would bring home monthly from the mission band. And the reports from Redbird Mission seemed to take hold of my mind. So I was thinking in terms of becoming a missionary to Redbird Mission. But when I was in the 5th grade, a guest speaker in our mission band meeting was Betty McBride, Mrs. Hiram McBride, the second wife of Dr. McBride. And she came and spoke to our mission band group and about the children in Nigeria. And from that Sunday morning forward, it was West Africa. There were times in my college years and in seminary years when I wondered if maybe it should be Latin America or maybe it should be Japan in that post-war era. But God continued to say Africa, and the way opened.
All of God.
I too was impressed when the missionaries came from a world beyond our farm. We all had chores and it was so close, so ingrown working. But when the missionaries came, they would tell such great stories. And one was for the Redbird Mission. I remember that. A man came from Alaska, told about the people, and always so loving and full of great stories of people that were different. They were different from what we were, but still it was the character of the people that were missionaries which struck me, even though at that time we never thought of being missionaries, but it still seemed to be part of that fellowship, the people that go way over yonder and do something exotic and great in with God's leading, stuck with us through the years. When I met Mary, that's what we got to do. But
Anyone, the call, the time you first remembered having that call. Praise God for it.
My call to want to be a missionary came when I was a teenager. And there was a younger missionary who'd been in Africa speaking in our church. He's sitting at the table with me right now. And he probably doesn't recall it, but he planted the seed when he spoke in our church. So Lowell is the one that kind of planted the seed in my case. But I want to say that not all people are called to be missionaries, just certain people. And I would point this out after I'd been in Sierra Leone. I was speaking in a church in Albert Lee, Minnesota, the United Methodist Church. And there was a young girl sitting in the audience. And after I spoke, she decided, I'm never going to be a missionary. And she is our current pastor, lead pastor in our church in Mankato.
Talk
about a mission field. That's
I have to say something.
I want to say something that is so pertinent because of what Jim was just saying, how people impact. When I was in seminary at the Evangelical Theological Seminary, Naperville, Illinois, there was a high schooler who was really quite outstanding. He was a member of First Church, and I attended there and was impressed with this high school student. And I began to pray for him. That was Clyde. And Marcia, you selected the reading of Samuel. It was that reading that was used at the service in which I accepted Jesus Christ as Savior. Now, how can these things be? But I praise God. God is good.
All the
Yes,
time.
God is
All the time.
God is good.
Hand back there, the lady back here, yes.
My own, Jim, after hearing you speak, wasn't altogether different than that. Because I had known Roger for quite some time, but it might have called to Christ a lot earlier, but the call to do something beyond that came one Sunday morning when Lowell was preaching at Central in Millbank. And as the service ended, I had become a widow at that time, and just not quite knowing what to do with life. And so as we're going out of church, I just knew that I really would like to go there. My whole career had been in eye care. And I said that to Lowell, I think I'd like to go there. And he said, and what do you do? He asked so kindly. And I said, well, I've worked for almost 40 years in the eye care field. He says, we need to talk. Over lunch, it was decided that I would go to Sierra Leone at some point in time. And later on, Roger and I got married, and everybody knew that we were going to Sierra Leone, and we weren't married yet. And I think the whole church was really worried about that. We took care of that before we left.
Thank you.
My mom was a nurse, and she would work oftentimes the swing shift, finishing at 11 p.m., which means that my dad was the one who, oversaw dinner and bedtime and all that, and he was very strict that I had to go to bed at 9 o'clock, but I could not sleep without my mom in the house. So I would lay in my bed and just stare out the window at the stars from 9 till a little after 11 when my mom got home, and then I could sleep because she was in the house. And as I stared at those stars, at some point, it dawned on me that people from all around the world can see the same stars that I can see. And it also dawned on me that people across time could see the same stars that I was seeing. And I realized I'm looking at the same star that Jesus saw. And I understood something about the Spirit uniting us all as I sat there and stared at the stars in my bed at night during those 2 hours that I was too scared to go to sleep. Now fast forward to my junior year in high school, I was assigned to do a research paper about a famous American, any famous American. The point was to learn how to document your sources. And at that time, there was an African-American congregation that had formed about a year earlier and was worshiping in our sanctuary. And I was curious why there was a separate service, and so I started to attend. So I would go to church with my family in the overwhelmingly white congregation, and then I would stay after and go to the African-American. I was the only white person there. And so when I got this assignment and it had a list of famous Americans, Martin Luther King's name was on the list. And to show how bad education was at the time, I wasn't sure, but I thought he might have something to do with African Americans. So I decided to do my paper about Martin Luther King. And I went to the bookstore and I bought all of the books that he's published, and I started with Strength to Love, which is his collection of sermons, and went through all of his books. And, hearkening back to that earlier feeling that we're all connected, Martin Luther King's sermons and his theology and his practice resonated so deeply with me. And when the paper was done, I felt like everything was gone now, like I wanted it to go on. And I wanted to be part of the civil rights movement, but this was the 1980s and there wasn't really a movement for me to join anymore. But my sister had just returned from Arizona, and she had become part of a movement helping Central Americans who were escaping from the war in Central America. And I was studying Spanish, and I plugged into that. And that really started a journey for me in, I would say, sort of learning to look at theological questions in a multifaceted way, not just from the one perspective in which I was born, but to understand God from so many different angles and from so many different experiences. And I feel like this experience, I have not yet been to Sierra Leone, but I'm scheduled to go in November. And I feel like this is just continuing on a journey of knowing God from so many perspectives. And it's just a beautiful journey to have that open understanding, because God is so much vaster and so much more complex than any one person or any one culture or all of us combined. God is bigger than all of us.
Anyone back here? You might have to come to me, Bill.
I noticed that when you got
I wrote.
You guys talking about being little kids when you first are introduced. My grandfather was a charter member of the Judd Methodist Church when I was, and so I knew that there was a long history in our family, and so we went to church every Sunday. I didn't know you didn't go to church on Sunday. I mean, that was just, you got up in the morning and you went, and there was a pastor there by the name of Reverend Frank Loomer. Anybody remember Frank Loomer? You remember Frank? He was just a big man. I thought, man, he's such a big man. And he would stop at our house because we were on there was a 3-point charge and we were on the out point. So he would have to go on the afternoon with one of the other 3 churches, and he'd stop at our house for dinner. I mean, so he was just kind of part of the family. But he would see me about 6 years, under 6 anyway. He'd kneel down, he'd look me in the eye and say, "Smiley, you're going to be a preacher." and I suppose this guy talks so much in church, I don't know. Anyway, for years I just remembered that. And then in that same church, there was a lady who put up an empty frame in the church and said, "The first person to come from this church to go into full-time Christian service." And my guess is she was trying to talk her daughter into doing it, but years later my picture was there. So anyway, I just think that the call comes in many different ways. I never decided to be a preacher until after I'd been in seminary for a year. How do you like that? I just I went to seminaries because I didn't want to go home and pick rock. That's the honest truth. It was quite an experience to be kind of moved in that direction all my life. So
Bill served in the Dakotas Conference for over 50 years in his retirement. Now, are there others over here? I can't think of all of this.
Something you felt the call?
Yes. And that was something else.
When I was a teenager, Vivian Olson came to our church camp whenever she was on leave, so I met her several times. I decided I wanted to be a math teacher and not a missionary. And somebody said, oh yes, you can teach math in Africa. I thought, oh, that's all right. But applied to Florida Mission,